Welcome to Impostor Hour with Liz and Greg. We're here to explore the imposter syndrome that haunts creatives, delving into how it affects their lives and work. Join us as we chat with authors and artists about creativity, self-doubt, featuring imposter characters in their stories, and the occasional imposter who pops up in their day-to-day lives.
Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Debbie Babbitt to the show. Debbie is the author of Saving Grace, named one of the most anticipated thrillers of 2021 by She Reads, and voted a debut of 2021 by Suspense magazine. First Victim, her second novel, was a Buzz Book of 2022. Previous creative incarnations include actress, playwright, drama critic, and copy director for two major Manhattan publishing companies. Her feature articles have appeared in Crime Reads, Suspense Magazine, and Mystery and Suspense Magazine. Debbie is a member of Mystery Writers of America, International Thriller Writers, and Sisters in Crime. The Man on the Train, Debbie's third novel, a Hitchcockian thriller set in New York City and the Hamptons, was published in 2024. Debbie, thanks for joining us.
Oh, I'm thrilled to be here. Thank you for having me. This is very exciting.
Absolutely.
And your bio is so fascinating and widespread. We were talking a little bit before we started recording that we have a few things in common, but one of the big ones is that we both worked in publishing before becoming writers. And I'm very interested in hearing about that evolution. So can you tell us a little bit about your path to publishing, and maybe you can throw in the acting, playwriting, all of the others in there?
All the many incarnations, yes. Well, I had been an actress, and I was always rewriting my lines, and I realized I really can't go on acting. Even though I went to school with John Turturro, and he put his whole family in all his films and would have done that with me, but I knew acting was not right for me at that point in my life. So I kind of segued into playwriting, and I read scripts for agents. And William Morris offered me a job as a junior agent to work my way up. And I said, I don't really want to be an agent. I want to be the talent. But that was kind of interesting too, because I met a lot of agents and learned that side of the business as well. So I'm writing plays and thinking, well, what's my next act? So I walked into a bookstore and thought, well, you know what? I say these Harlequin romances. Maybe I could write a Harlequin romance, even though I don't read romance. So I meet a woman there, and she's looking at the books, and I don't want this stranger to think I would read romances. So I said, I'm thinking of writing one. And she said, really? My sister's associate publisher at Harlequin, and they need back cover writers. And I said, what do you mean? You mean you can get paid to write synopses on the back? She said, yes. I said, oh my God. So I met her sister. I remember her name was Carolyn. She was the associate publisher. She picks up a paperback and she rips off the back cover and says, write the back cover. So I studied every book in the store. And I came up with 3 different versions, which I became famous for, not because I had so many ideas, but I was insecure about each one. So I kept writing a new one. And so as she said, I think you have a future. They started giving me work. Then I made a portfolio and took it to all the publishing houses, and Random House, Simon and Schuster, they all started giving me freelance work. And I thought, this is fantastic. And then Walter Zacharias, I don't know if you knew him or heard of him. He owned Kensington, which was the only family owned publishing house left at that point. Very small. They'd never had a copy director. They had just hired a lawyer. So they said, would you like a position as copy director? I said, oh, I don't know. I'm not into working in an office. I'm a free spirit. And my husband, Ted, said, well, you could always quit. So I took the job, created a position of copy director. And then I was there a few years when Penguin, which was merging with Putnam at the time, offered me a job. And I took the job there. And then I started thinking, I'm writing all this great best-selling, copy for all these big authors. Why don't I write a book? And I always loved books, always loved novels. I loved playwriting because I love dialogue, but books I felt gave me so much more that I could play with. And a first person point of view would be like a 400-page monologue, which is great.
Right.
So I took the position at Penguin, and I was there a while, and that's when I wrote Saving Grace. And I sent that out, and I got an agent, and he got me a publishing deal with Otto Penzler's company, who was just starting a new imprint called Scarlet at that time, about 4 years ago.
Right.
And it was supposed to be psychological suspense by and for women, but he got a lot of backlash because men felt, well, what about us? Even though we know it's, the women centric world now. So that was nice getting in on the ground floor. And all my 3 books have been published with Penzler. And I have to say that my editor there, Louisa Cruz Smith, who is the daughter of Martin Cruz Smith,
Right.
Oh, wow.
is amazing. So it's been quite an experience moving from acting to playwriting to novel writing. But I really love books. So I feel like I'm where I belong writing. And thrillers, of course. I
Right.
love thrillers.
Well, I'm curious, coming from an acting background, do you take a similar approach when you're crafting character on the page as you did when you were kind of, putting a character together for a performance?
That's a very good question. And I love talking about that, Greg, because for me, everything starts with character.
Yep.
And Stanislavski said character is action.
Right.
So for me, a character starts talking to me, and that's everything. And with Saving Grace, it was an 11-year-old orphan in the South. Don't ask, I've never been there. She just started talking to me. So it is character. And I remember when I was acting, I would write pages and pages biography. And there came a point where I didn't even want to get up and perform. I just wanted to keep writing, all the backstory for your character.
Right. Right.
So for me, everything is character. And then, of course, you have to craft the plot. But yes, it's all about the character. Thank you for asking that, because that's everything for me.
Yeah.
Well, we're just a trio of theater nerds today.
I
aren't
know,
we?
this is incredible. I
Go into it.
know. Oh my God.
Well,
I know.
I'm thinking about where Greg and I went at Marymount. We studied Udahagen a lot, and we had to do extensive kind of character backgrounds. So I still have like journals filled with character backstories, and I realized that without knowing at the time, that was really like inspiring me to think about the origin stories of characters and people.
Yes.
And even though, in that time and place, I was doing backgrounds on characters that other playwrights had written, and they were kind of well-known backgrounds, I would sometimes take liberties that kind of gave me that like first feeling like maybe this is something I want to go towards more than the performance part. And I'm wondering for you, I know you touched on it a little bit, there's obviously the performing and being in front of people, and then there's playwriting and novel writing where it's a lot more solo. Do you miss the performance aspect, or do you bring that into now your book promotion?
Well, that's interesting. I did miss it for a while. That feeling when you're going on stage and your heart rate, and it's like you hold the audience in the palm of your hand, whether they cry or laugh. Very exciting. And yes, it's very different when you write plays, everyone gets up and performs. So you still have a communal feeling. Books are very solo. You have all these dark nights of the soul. You're by yourself in your room writing, except when you're doing promotions and book signings, etc. But yes, it's a very different art. It's very different. And it's interesting because Louisa would say to writers who weren't actors, you should read your dialogue out loud and hear how stilted it sounds. For me, the dialogue just comes because the rhythms, being a playwright and an actor. So I would speak a lot of my words out loud just for myself and to feel you're not so alone. But there is a part of me that likes that solitary aspect and likes being in that writing cave. And that's why I feel books are better for me than plays, because sometimes, I love talking to people and I love the questions I'm asked, but sometimes I can't wait to get back into my writing cave and be solitary. Yes, it's very different because when you're not acting without a group.
Right.
But when you're writing, you can always be writing. You don't need anyone else.
Right.
So it's interesting. It is. I've gotten more used to it now. I don't crave the spotlight as much as I used to. Except when I get up and start talking to people.
Right. I'd love to ask you a bit more about the thing you just sort of touched on, because, I've had the pleasure, Debbie, of seeing you at a number of our kind of mutual friends, author events, and I know that you're on the road a lot promoting books and things like that. So how do you go about kind of striking that balance between the writing itself and then all of the other stuff that goes along with being an author, that career?
It takes a lot of balance, I'll tell you, because I really like to get up in the morning and write.
Yeah.
And that's my best time. And I do try to do that. And then I like to go to the gym and I try to schedule my events for afternoons and evenings. But you're right, it takes a lot. It takes a lot of energy too. For, I did a lot. I was just in Florida for 6 months and I did a lot of libraries and readings at bookstores. And I try to balance it out. But sometimes it's hard because you're supposed to be on social media a lot too, which I'm trying not to do because that could take up all your time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's hard to strike the balance, but I think I've kind of hit on setting time aside for the writing and then doing the events and trying to do those more in the afternoon and evening and cutting back a little when I have to, like when I have a deadline for a book.
Yeah.
So because the most important thing to me is the book
Yeah.
and getting the book written and out there.
Yeah.
Debbie, I'm wondering, my experience was I found that like my theater background was a positive asset in writing books, and that my publishing background ended up being in some ways more of a detriment, in that I felt very self-conscious about the business part of it, kind of being an insider, knowing the business of it. Did you have that experience, or maybe an opposite experience? Was that factoring in when you were writing your first book? Were you thinking about like your colleagues, how the business works? Is this going to market well? That kind of stuff?
Yeah, it's interesting because when I spoke with my publisher, I said to him, first of all, I have to write my own flap and back cover copy.
Mm.
I can't trust anyone else to do it. I'm so used to doing this, and I'm so used to knowing when you do copy for thrillers and mysteries
Mhm.
that you have to be careful what you write.
Right.
You can't have spoilers,
Right.
and you can't give too much away. So that was sort of like he didn't really want to relinquish that much control. So I did find that being an insider helped on that level in terms of the marketing. But on the other hand, authors who weren't in the business might have been very happy with someone else writing the copy, and as opposed to my feeling I needed to control so much more of it,
Right.
because authors usually don't,
Mhm.
except the ones who get full control over art and copy with the biggest authors. But I felt it was helpful. I felt it was helpful being an insider. And when he finally realized that I could write the best copy for the book, he said, "Oh, less work for me." He finally realized. So that was good. So I say it was a positive experience,
That's great.
having also been in publishing, I think.
Mm.
I'll give that a little more thought as well. And copy editing, of course, going over the grammar, things that they might miss that we would not miss. I don't know if you've had that with your books where
Yeah.
you've caught things they didn't catch.
Yeah. Yeah.
And when sometimes right?
Well, and it's not, I would say, Dutton is fantastic on that end, but sometimes it's just even things that people wouldn't normally catch, because Greg and I write so many Easter eggs to each other that are like cultural references that I think, a copy editor probably isn't seeing like the nuance of. They're just like, what the hell is this?
Right.
Right. And it's funny, Dutton, of course, Dutton was one of my big imprints when I was there. And that was Elaine Coster, that was her baby.
Mhm.
All the authors she had, the big ones, the ones she turned down, didn't take on Grisha. There were many she didn't take on, but I know it's like there have been things the copy editor catches, though. They're very good with times, like for Men on the Train, the times.
Mhm.
So we had this whole reel going about the 8:02 is coming down the tracks. Well, by the time the book was ready to come out, the schedule had changed for Metro North.
All right.
So she said, "Oh, you can't say the 8:02 anymore. It's got to be the 8:04." So, and certain logistics they were able to get, when a train arrives and how soon, stuff that I'm not as proficient at necessarily.
Mhm.
But spelling and grammar, that was something that was always my strength. I was in a spelling bee when I was in 6th grade. I could citywide spelling bee.
Nice.
Yes.
Well, I'm curious about that. I'd love to ask you a little more about that, because the Man on the Train, from a structural standpoint, is incredibly ambitious, right? You have these, you have multiple POVs, you have a shifting timeline that kind of cuts back and forth in time. And I wanted to ask, like, do you tend to map things out early on? Are you more of a planner, or are you able to kind of do that stuff on the fly and sort of keep track of all those shifts? How do you tend to work?
I'm definitely more of a pantser
Okay.
because I like my characters to talk to me and see where they lead. And then, of course, you've got to bring it all together. Yes.
Right.
So Guy came to me first. He was my first male character,
Yep.
and he came to me full blown. In fact, he had been in my head for quite a while. He was there,
Mm.
and so I always felt it was his story,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I knew that we would go back and forth with the past. And my editor Louisa said, "Could you give the wife a bigger role?"
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I said, well, it is called The Man on the Train, but that's okay. It's not the wife on the train. But so by giving Linda a bigger role, that enabled me to use the time periods by
Mm.
having Guy in the past and Linda in the present. It actually opened up a whole new way of working
Yeah.
as opposed to him, going back and trying to remember. So it wasn't as hard to keep track because he was in my mind and I knew his story when he meets this beautiful woman, and in the past and in the present.
Right.
And Linda opened up a little more for me.
Okay.
And especially as a prosecutor, and then she travels to Montauk. So I thought it all sort of started to coalesce for me, and it made it a lot easier. But I didn't like just, some authors will just write the past and then they'll just write the present, or
Right.
they'll have it set one way or the other, and then you want them to inform each other and come together at just the right time, of course.
Sure.
So I think that helped me a lot, knowing that he had this past,
Okay.
in Montauk, and I was going to make sure he was there in the past, not in the present, looking back, and
Right.
that Linda would be there. So it actually, it coalesced for me without having to have a whole storyboard and having to do all this plotting. But on the other hand, I then had to, as you know, writing thrillers, should this chapter be here? Should it be there? We can't reveal too much too soon, but what do we know that the character doesn't know, and the reader shouldn't know what they don't know yet? So
Right.
right. So that's where a lot of the work comes in.
Yeah.
Organizing. It's almost like organizing the chapters then.
Yeah. Yeah. In a way.
And especially with you're right though, with two time frames, it does make it a little more complicated.
But to your point, and that it's funny, it hadn't occurred to me when I was reading it, but now that you say it, it comes very clear. Because it's set in two timelines, and each of those timelines sort of is in the present in terms of the POV and the narrative voice, it really does make everything feel much more immediate and kind of, the stakes higher, rather than having something that's like told as a flashback. It really does have that the present tense immediacy. So yeah, no,
Yes.
yeah.
And that's something I learned in acting. There was a teacher named Robert Modica who taught at Carnegie Hall.
Right.
De Niro studied Pacino, and his whole point was you have to always be in the moment.
Yep.
And he would never let you come onto stage through a door and say, well, where'd you come from? You didn't just walk on and say, where were you before all? We know all this, right? So as an author, I feel I have to always be in the moment, and I have to make sure my characters are in the moment.
Yep.
So it's sort of you have to feel it and know that this is what's happening now, even when it's in the past, that it has that immediacy. And I think that informs our writing as actors, don't you think? Because you're always in the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
Indeed.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I'm hoping that immediacy comes across.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
Definitely.
That's what you hope when you write, because it's hard to, you can't like plan it out. You just have to, as you know, with your books.
Well, I love the kind of the metaphor of the train, and as it relates to the propulsiveness of your book. I mean, you write really forward momentum, short chapters, everything is very organized. It feels, the way the book is structured feels very apropos to the story itself. And you've kind of done one of the hardest things I think about writing thriller suspense is the tightrope walk of being able to write a story that is so taut, and then you can't really talk about the story or the book with anyone else who hasn't read it, because all of the mysteries therein. So this is a very convoluted way to kind of ask you, you said something earlier about writing marketing copy for mysteries and thrillers being a special skill, right? Because you want to make it really intriguing, but you can't tip your hat too much and have any spoilers. So how do you, with your book, The Man on the Train, talk about it, promote it, entice people to read it while really not saying too much? Even in asking this question, I'm like, I don't want to say too much. I noticed you used the word Hitchcockian, which I think is earned. What does that kind of like mean to you? when you use a word like that to describe the book?
Well, I guess the feeling of, in all thrillers, nothing being what it seems. And I had written an article for Crime Reads about, they wanted me to write my 10 favorite Hitchcock films. And I was so surprised at how many took place on trains, even if just for a few minutes, like Strangers on a Train, just for a few minutes. That forward momentum.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess that I think of Hitchcock, and the publisher sort of came up with that as well, that you're moving quickly somewhere, you're going somewhere, but where you're going and the characters you're meeting and what's really happening under the surface.
Right.
And is there even someone on a train? I mean, there were great Hitchcock things where there'd be a storefront and then it wasn't there the next week. And there's so many places to hide on a train, but you can't get off.
Mm-hmm.
And I guess it's the forward momentum, the feeling of you're on a train, and I think that's why he set so many of his stories on trains. The lady vanishes,
Mm-hmm.
where you don't know where she is on the train, and there's just so much you can do. And I was even going to extend some of those scenes on the train.
Mm-hmm.
But what I talk about mostly, since it's called The Man on the Train, when I'm selling the books and talking to people, is what happens when a married man meets a beautiful stranger on his morning commute.
Mm,
And of
perfect.
course, nothing being what it seems, because that's really the MacGuffin, of course,
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
when someone sits down next to him on the train,
Yeah.
and that gets everything moving.
Yeah.
And that's kind of why we started it with the wife's chapter at the beginning and then went back in time a few weeks.
Right.
Mm.
So that immediacy also for the wife to get right into what's happening. But I think, I just think with Hitchcock, everything's also character for me with him.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Everything's character and all the interrelationships and things you don't learn right away.
Mhm.
And I just think he was one of the most brilliant filmmakers ever. So,
Yeah.
but of all of my 3 books, that's the one closest to him, I'd say. And I
Mhm.
know that's why he chose trains. You could choose anything else, but a
Mhm.
train. There's so much mystery.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And oh my God, it just gives me. And every time you see a train, you don't feel the same way about seeing a bus or a plane or a car. It's just, and it was hard to give a title because there's the girl on the train.
Right.
Mhm.
You know, there's a lot of, and at one point my publisher said, how about The Man from Montauk? Because it does end up in a town based on Montauk.
Right.
Mhm.
And I said, well, if he was from there, that would be one thing, but he's not from Montauk, which doesn't give anything away.
Right.
Coming up with the title, but I thought train should be in the title.
Mhm.
I hope that answered your question about Hitchcock.
Absolutely. Yeah, no. And I think, well, I'm glad you brought up the title because I want to ask about that, but I also wanted to just point out something you do that I really appreciated, and it was probably intentional but made me think of Hitchcock, which is you use really subtle things like the color of a dress, or there's like little Hitchcockian Easter eggs throughout. So for those of us who are real Hitchcock nerds, which Greg and I are, we used to go see Hitchcock every time it was in any theater anywhere in New York,
Right, I know.
because it's like, it's it, every time you watch one of those movies, or I should speak for myself, every time I watch one of those movies, even if it's like the 50th time, I notice something new. And
Oh,
that new thing has significance to the plot. So you really see the care that's been put into those little details. And I felt
and
that in your
yes,
book, so
thank
I'm
you.
sure if I go back and read it for a second or a third time, there'll be things I didn't notice the first time. And I think that's also a hallmark of a really good, mystery, suspense, thriller. There's just so many things that are so many clues, right?
Right, and the
Throughout.
attention to detail. And that's why
Mm-hmm.
you have to go back once you get to the plot part and you want everything to work. Sometimes you have to add a little more, sprinkle some things in,
Mm-hmm.
move things around. And also, for me, because it's all about character, I want the twists and turns to be organic,
Mhm.
meaning it's the character's behavior. And I know there are authors who start with the twist. Everyone starts with something different, but I can't do that because it has to come from my character's actions. And if that creates a twist or reveal, oh, who knew? But it's their
Mhm.
actions. It's,
Mm-hmm.
that led to it. For me, that makes it real for me.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
That I know the people and I understand why. And that's why I probably write and rewrite so much, to really get to know the character.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
It takes a while to really, because there's so many hidden facets
Yeah.
Right.
that you
Right.
don't know, right? As authors, that
Yeah.
you it takes a while to really get to know them too.
Totally.
When you're going into the process, do you do any sort of character Bible up front, or is it more kind of locking in once you start writing forward on the page and getting to know them through those kind of early chapters?
That's a great question. I used to talk into a recorder.
Mm-hmm.
I don't have it with me now because it broke and I have so much on it, but I would talk into a recorder with all these character ideas,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't the real writing.
Yeah.
And then I would input the recorder into the computer and more ideas would come. So it'd be hundreds of pages of non writing, just
Yeah.
about character
Mhm.
and snippets of dialogue. And every time I did that, I learned more about the character.
Mm-hmm.
But it took a while to then get to this sitting down and writing
Right.
the book.
Right.
Mhm.
And then once that happened, more things came because you're in the moment and it's organic. But yes, and talking a lot. And now I do it into the phone, which gets all the words wrong. It's horrible, but it's unbelievable. But that's what happens. And the character starts expanding and expanding. And I'm sure you've had this too, where they may take you down a road and that might not be the road you ultimately go down with them, depending on the story you're telling. So that can happen too. I feel like maybe from acting too, that I have so many possibilities. I almost feel like I wish I could do a Clue thing where I could have 20 different ways it goes and 20 different endings. And that's what's happening. Well, I'll get into this later, but I feel that I could go so many ways with a character, and that means you need to finally figure out the story.
Right.
Right.
And then your character will tell you, hopefully, this is the story.
Right.
And then you can start delving deeper
Right.
into the character and the other characters who suddenly appear
Right.
in the
It's like,
story, right?
right. In a way, it sort of forces your hand to then specify enough for the character to then make those decisions. You know?
Right,
You kind of guide them a
exactly.
little bit. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, and you could, I'm sure you've had this where you can write chapters, so many chapters, and then you realize this isn't, you just like wrote yourself into a hole, and was this really what I wanted to write? And
Right.
sometimes I don't even know, like a friend, some author friends have said, well, just think about the story you want to tell,
Mhm.
and then you're fine. But that's not what happens because it's so fluid and
Right.
things change, and
Right.
Right.
so you have to think about that maybe a little later.
Right. Right.
Well,
The story your character wants to tell for you.
For you. Right. Yes. Exactly.
Right?
I mean,
I'm sure you get.
a lot of authors talk about this kind of difference between like plotter and pantser, but I'm thinking more that it's like, for me, it's like an arm wrestle between, am I in control or the characters in control? And there is a point that I've experienced, you just kind of touched on it, Debbie, where like you're with the character and you're kind of plotting and writing them forward, and then you realize you've written yourself into a corner. But it's when I let the character kind of lead me that I'm like, oh, this is where the story wants to go. Like I actually don't have that much control over this.
That's great. I have to remember that because I'm having something going on right now. That's true. Very good.
It's just
Very
kind of
good.
surrendering to, the character and trusting that they're going to lead you. I mean, and maybe that's just one kind of writing, but that's definitely what I relate to. But I want to go back to title because I think there's a lot of like interesting threads with your time in publishing. I think you have a really keen knowledge of like marketing and copy, obviously, and then you have a title that's very similar to The Girl on the Train, which you mentioned, which was a huge, probably after Gone Girl was the biggest book in this category. So when I first heard the title, I thought, wow, that's really smart from a marketing point of view, just for like SEO, but also for people who loved Girl on the Train, just association, right? And publishing, we're always looking for the next book that you can compare.
Right.
So,
exactly.
It sounds like though that wasn't at all your intention. And does that?
No, it wasn't.
Does that?
I had a different title, actually, a working title for a while. In fact, my publisher said he was worried. He said people might think it's a satire because of Girl on the Train. He said, "You sure we should keep that title?" But once I thought of it, I thought it has to be this title.
Yeah.
But he was actually concerned about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then I did start thinking about people, and people have asked me, "Is this related at all to Girl on the Train, or does this have anything to do with that?" And I said, no. But yeah, marketing wise, you'd think, right?
Yeah, no, I think it actually, it works in your favor. It's not going to work against you. And having
Right.
read the book, it's absolutely the right title.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
if you write Gone Boy, then people might start wondering, like, if you're really just, if this is your shtick. But it doesn't sound like that's what you're doing.
Well,
Now, and now that the wife has a much bigger role,
yeah.
I had said to my editor, well, it's not called The Wife on the Train.
Yeah.
She definitely was an expanded role, which,
Mm.
it's interesting. A lot of readers have written into me to say how much they love her. So it
Yeah.
was probably,
Oh.
I guess, because she was for her husband and she was trying to figure it out, and people like that. So I think that was a good way to go,
Mhm.
because she's playing this very active role in the present,
Yeah.
trying to figure it all out.
Well,
Mm.
now that you mentioned Linda again, kind of bringing her back in, one of the things I wanted to ask you is, a lot of the kind of, as we mentioned, it's a dual timeline. So a lot of the action in the present timeline very closely echoes the past timeline. And
Yes.
also, Linda and Guy, your two main characters, a lot of the events of the past are sort of laden with trauma and have pushed them towards the life that they're currently inhabiting with some sort of baggage, let's say, right? A lot of what's kind of happened is coming in now, and this, I guess, this is sort of an extension of what we were talking about your kind of character first approach. But if you could maybe talk, this might be useful for younger writers or people like starting out and kind of trying to figure out how to structure things and how to get that kind of character first. The importance of that. Could you just talk about the importance of, I guess, that kind of the specific history and backstory in terms of bringing a character into kind of a three-dimensional, jumping off the page type of thing?
Yeah. Linda came to me after Guy. I mean, he came to
Yeah.
me full blown.
Yep.
Linda, not as much. I knew she was his wife. I knew she was a prosecutor. I knew she had trauma in her past
Yep.
along with him. I just, that I kind of, but again, as I was writing her and she was talking to me, I actually learned that she did have a trauma and what that trauma was.
Yeah.
And that helped me understand her better. It helped me. It helped in terms of her understanding her husband, feeling it was almost the two of them against the world at one point because
Yeah.
he had his own traumas.
Yep.
Mhm.
So I thought that was a really nice fit. And and they've been married a long time. So I thought that was important that they felt they had this. And even if something has been lost, it is something that's binding them together,
Yeah.
and it
Mm.
it figures in. So I think that's very important for me to feel that I need to know the character's past. I need to know why they're the way they are. And interesting, and this isn't quite the same subject, but I did want to bring this in, especially as you're suspense authors.
Mm.
Most thrillers have characters with pasts, right?
Sure.
Mhm.
There's always a past. Okay. So my agent had been talking to me about the kind of thrillers like North by Northwest,
Yeah.
where there isn't a past, but the character, it's external action where the character is thrust into a situation
Right.
that has nothing to do with his life or his past.
Yep.
And so he said he said that's a different way of writing. And he says that he thinks that's very interesting. And I said, it is interesting, but there are, and that's a film. I don't know if it makes a difference, but I can't think of a lot of thrillers and suspense books where characters don't have past that figure into the story.
Yes. True.
Mm.
Good point.
I mean, I haven't read every thriller.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And actually, now that I say it, I did read, I want to know what the big fuss was about Frida McFadden.
Mm.
So I read The Housemaid. Was that the first book?
Yeah.
And that isn't about a character's past necessarily, except how another character wants to use that. So that maybe didn't have necessarily a real backstory.
Yeah.
But I think most thrillers do.
Yeah.
And I wonder if you lose something if you don't have that and it's an external situation, or does that work better in films? I'll ask you guys that.
That's a good question. I mean, I think
Yeah.
that very much to the point you're making, I mean, certainly when you're working in the realm of psychological suspense, which we all do, backstory, I think, is crucial. But that raises a very good point. Something where it's a character thrust into kind of a fish out of water story. I guess
Right.
that's a different way of getting tension built into a premise that you then can see through. And you're doing that. The mechanics of that, I guess, would be different than psychological suspense, where you are going, even though it's forward propulsion in the plot, you are going back in time a lot to sort of at least referencing or citing a character's backstory. So I guess
Right.
the engine's a little bit different in those two.
Yeah, now that you say that, that does make me think in all three of my books, I have two time periods.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if I would ever, in fact, the book I just finished that's with my agent now, same thing. So I'm thinking now that, yeah, it would be writing a book where you're not going back and forth necessarily.
Yeah.
Mm.
That's interesting. Yeah, I'm just wondering if it works better in films or it's just because it was Hitchcock, of course, and many think that's his greatest film anyway. But
Sure.
Well, and this doesn't really fall directly into the realm of like the genres we're talking about, but it's making me think about, Debbie, in your book, Guy has like a real love for the classics, and he specifically talks about Tolstoy. He talks about Dostoevsky and like some other classic, in those cases Russian. I'm thinking of also, Kafka, Czech. When we had John Payne on, and he talked about Citizen Orloff, which kind of is a book where it's a fish out of water and we don't have a main character with a backstory. This is kind of, I think, a theme that comes up with some of these classics that are mentioned in your book as well. So I love the kind of cross-pollination of your taking these more surrealist, what's really happening, classic books and subject matter, and then like embedding them in a very kind of formulaic thriller suspense. So it's just something I wanted to mention, because as you were saying that, I thought about John Payne. Do you agree, Greg? Citizen Orloff is kind of in that realm.
It is, now that you mentioned it. That's actually a great example. And also, and I'm glad you mentioned that, Liz, because one of the things that really grabbed me about The Man on the Train is that it becomes almost like this love letter to literature.
Yeah, for sure.
And Debbie, you mentioned at the top of the interview that you were, you've always been a big reader, and that not necessarily romance, but but mystery and things like that. I would just love to know sort of maybe a little bit of your personal history around how you kind of fell in love with books and how that has, guided you along the years.
Well, my mother was an avid reader, and we all know that everything is exposure, especially when you're young.
Sure.
And my father too; they had books all over the house. But my mother was a mystery reader, so all she had in the house were mysteries.
Okay.
So I started reading mysteries, and I loved them immediately.
Yep.
And I couldn't wait to get my hands on the latest yellow and black Nancy Drew book. They were all yellow and black, and my classmates would bring me the book. So that was my experience. But then I thought, what could be better than a mystery or suspense with the ultimate stakes, especially if it's murder? So I came from a family of readers, and that helped a lot. And I always felt I could escape into a book. And I got a little sidetracked with the performing, which was all wonderful, very nice. But there's something about books that, yes, you can escape into a play, but it's a communal experience. You're sitting in the audience watching. But there's something very intimate about reading a book and getting lost in a book. And I also liked romantic suspense, I have to say. There was an Australian, New Zealand author named Dorothy Eden I adored, but there was always suspense. There was always things not being what they seem. And that actually is something that's very important to me. And I think most thrillers, what's real and what's not. Are things what they seem? When aren't they what they seem? And I guess you can do that in mystery. So that's been my background. And I see that the genres, it's always been great, but now it's exploding. Thriller, so many different kinds of thrillers, suspense, romantic suspense. I don't know, maybe it's overtaken the romance field.
Well, now
I'd like to think so.
Romantically, dragon sex.
Oh, wait a minute. There's the science fiction fantasy. Wait a minute. I take that back, because when I'm doing book signings at the bookstores, so many people are at the science fiction fantasy shelves. Oh my God. And that's never been a favorite of mine, ever. I feel like science fiction, except I loved Star Trek. I feel like it's random. You can create random universes, and it just doesn't ring true, authentic. It's not authentic for me.
Okay.
Fantasy. I never liked horror either, even though I love Stephen King because I thought he wrote great characters.
Right.
But I never liked the supernatural or horror either.
Yeah.
I like some gothics. I like goth. I used to like and read gothic romances. I liked those.
Okay. Nice.
Because of atmosphere. Atmosphere
Right.
is very important
Yes.
too.
Yeah. Very much so. Well, let me use that as a segue, because you mentioned earlier, you alluded to the fact that this is set in it's not quite Montauk, but it's a town based on Montauk. And for me, it was interesting reading it because I grew up on the east end of Long Island. I grew up.
Oh, that's right. You told.
Yeah, I grew up a couple towns just west of Montauk. Like our junior prom was actually at Gurney's Inn in Montauk. So.
Oh my God.
Yeah. So I grew up there and spent a lot of time. And when I was reading it was interesting because there are certain things that you do kind of alter a couple clicks for the purposes of, like, there are some things that happen historically in the book that don't actually happen. So I understand why you did that. But what you do is you do a very good job of getting the kind of the feel and the kind of atmosphere, as you said, and the kind of fabric of that small town mentality, and also the specifics of that town in particular. And I'd love to just kind of ask, in terms of like your research process, in terms of like location and setting and things like that, what, how that plays in.
Well, that's very interesting because Louisa, my editor, has said that she gets a strong sense of setting in my books. And that's when people ask me, and Grace, did I ever go to Northwest Arkansas? And I said, no. But it's funny, Greg, too. I love small towns, even though I love New York, and I feel like I'm this big city girl, although my neighborhoods are like towns. So I love small towns. I have it in all the books. And in Montauk, and I lived in Amagansett for 20 years also.
Right.
So I really know it out there. And I knew Montauk when it was the easternmost tip and it was totally undeveloped.
Sure.
But I really feel strongly about these small towns, and Mike Bonneker, Bonneker family. So I just feel like there's something I really like about small towns, writing about small towns. Maybe it's because everybody knows each other. It's a setting where it's manageable. It's not a big city. But I'll tell you something interesting about the names of the towns. The reason it's not called Montauk is because there's no abandoned lighthouse in Montauk.
That's right. I figured that part out. I was like, okay.
You knew that, of course. So all my towns have been fictional because Louisa said readers will write in and tell you everything you got wrong.
Yes.
Which is why in Saving Grace, the town was based on Jasper. I named it Repentance. And Lowood in First Victim was Lowville. But I named it Lowood. Do you know what Lowood really is? It's not a town.
No, I don't think so.
It was the school in Jane Eyre.
Oh, wow.
I think it was.
That's a great Easter egg right there.
So, but I want to tell you a quick story. So I have in Saving Grace, there's a blizzard in part 2, which is very integral to the plot.
Okay.
So somebody from Norton sales team says, I lived in Northwest Arkansas and it never snowed. So Louisa says, well, you changed the town to Repentance. Can you change the name of the state? I said, wait a minute. Our town is Grover's Corners, New Hampshire. Gone Girl is, I forget, the Boot Heel of Missouri, but it's a real state. I forgot the name of the town.
Right.
I'm not changing the name of the state. So my husband, Ted, did research, and he found 2 major snowstorms that took place in Northwest Arkansas in the last few years. But that's the kind of thing where you have to create fictional names. And I took Manitowoc because of the Montauk Indians.
Yeah, right.
So I figured people would know. You know that, of course. I figured people would know it's Montauk.
Sure.
But that's why, I really wanted to use the real names of towns. I don't know if you've had the experience where, you can't use real names.
Right.
Often.
Yeah.
Oftentimes, depending, unless you're not changing anything.
Well, right. Exactly. Yeah. But
I think Canaletto, the artist, moved a whole town over in one of his paintings. But anyway, but I love small towns.
Yeah.
And I think every book I'm going to have a small town, even if I have to change the name.
It occurs to me, we've just been so engrossed asking you questions, Debbie. We have forgotten to ask the big question, which is about imposter syndrome.
I knew you'd get to that.
There we go.
And you you strike me as someone who's very confident in their craft, both on the page and in person. I know we're not in person, but just talking to you, and you're a former performer, and I wouldn't look at you or your bio and think you have imposter syndrome. So why are you here? We're happy you're here.
Well, you know what Richard Burton said?
What's that?
Every time he performed, he said, they're all going to find out I'm really a fraud.
That's right.
Right. There it is.
And I think you said, what am I really doing? What am I doing?
Right.
But, well, we all have dark nights of the soul, and I'm sure you've had it in your writing. And it's interesting because you two write together, which I would love to get into at some point, because I've never collaborated with anyone. I was going to write a musical with a friend, but I said, I don't know if I can collaborate. I have to think about that. But yes, there are times, you're working on your book, you're working on your project, and you're thinking, does this work? Are readers going to like this? Because Louise always says, well, you have to write for yourself, but you have to write for your readers. You have to think about them. You can't let them get too confused or have too many characters. There are a lot. You have to make sure you're thinking about your reader. So I do go through that, when I'm in the process of writing a book.
Yeah.
Will this work? Am I writing this for me? Will readers understand what I'm trying to say? Do I have to make it simpler? And then you start questioning yourself, which I'm sure you understand. And I was going to ask you, is that why you started this idea for this podcast, for the imposter syndrome? There must have been something that led you to have this show.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, I think imposter syndrome is something that has come up for both of us individually and together from, book to book to book, and the one thing we kept coming across in conversations with other, friends who are in creative industries is that they were feeling it too, but no one was really talking about it. And, obviously it kind of aligns with the imposter character theme, which we were in the midst of writing Trust Issues, which is about a con man, and doing all of this research on imposters and imposter characters. And then our book was also based on loosely a friend of ours who was taken by a real con man. So it was kind of the Russian nesting doll of the three: imposter syndrome, imposter characters, and then real life imposters. But I think in doing this podcast, we've personally, and I hope for our guests too, have achieved the one thing we found in our research, that there's no cure for imposter syndrome, but you can treat it by talking about it and commiserating with people. So, it's really been powerful. Greg, I don't want to speak for you. I wouldn't say my imposter syndrome is gone by any stretch, but when I feel myself kind of getting pulled into that direction, I can think of 50 people off the top of my head who, on public record on this podcast, have said, yes, I have it too. And here's how it manifests.
Yeah.
No, I understand that. I talk to authors. In fact, I've been going back and forth with one author, talking, sharing all this. And what's interesting about that is you want to come across a certain way, and you have a persona, and there are people who perceive things as weakness, will perceive it, and they're looking to try to bring you down in life. So I've never been circumspect that way. I'm very open and emotional and open, and I usually say what I feel. And then sometimes people will say things that are so cruel, and it's because I'm being open, and then they're not being open. They're not choosing now to respond that way. They're choosing to get in there and dig in and take what you've given them. So we do kind of put protective armors around ourselves at times, so that we're not showing weakness. And so that's why this is so interesting to me, because it's a way to share how you feel. And I have found it with authors. We've been doing a lot of messaging each other, talking about how we feel. And none of these authors are acting like, oh, so she'll think I couldn't get an agent, or she'll think this was a bad book. No one's thinking that. We're all sharing how we feel. And so I think this is so wonderful that you're doing this, because people can start to shed that protective armor, not with everyone, because there are people out there, we know, but at least in our business or fellow artists.
Mhm.
You know, you want to feel you have a safe place.
Right.
Yeah.
You need to feel safe.
Yeah.
And it's hard. It's hard to feel safe. And that's why, you know, you're careful with people. And sometimes that's why I like to escape into my books, because I control my characters, except when they control us, as you said, Liz. Um, but they can't hurt me.
Right.
They can't say anything to me that is going to upset me, because they're my characters.
Right.
So sometimes that's like a safe place
Yeah.
to be. And we were talking about that, and that's kind of nice about the solitary aspect.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But on the other hand, it's nice to be able to commiserate with others. And I find more and more authors totally open.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think it's just great you're doing this, because no one even thinks of it or even uses that word.
Mm.
You
Yeah.
know, it's had so many different definitions over the years.
Right.
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 Well, I think for us, you know, kind of just to build on what Liz has already said, but it was finding that was such a, you know, when you would have, let's say, you know, when you run into an author at a conference and you had a coffee or something like that, and it was a little more one-on-one, you know, it would come up when people were, you know, were willing to share a little bit and be a little bit more vulnerable. You realize that these are the things that we're all kind of grasping with or grappling with individually. And to your point, Debbie, earlier, you know, like it is a fairly isolated thing. So I think what happens, a lot of the rub from that comes from, we're all sitting in, you know, in our offices, at our desks, in our coffee shops or whatever, doing this very solitary thing. And we're having this thought. And then once you realize that all of us are kind of having this universal thought individually and feeling maybe self-conscious about it or fearful or whatever, the more I think that you can kind of stoke a sense of community and be able to commiserate. I think it just makes it more, you know, you feel less alone and you feel like maybe it's a little bit less of an uphill climb. So I think that's been a big motivation for us to kind of do it.
That's great. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Exactly right. And it's just so helpful, because at first, you know, I thought, oh, okay, should I talk about feeling like an imposter? Why not?
Yeah.
I'm so I
Mhm.
have to be open. Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
And a lot of actors feel that way
Yes.
also.
Yeah.
You know, and maybe writers, I don't know about less, because we're writing words. You know, Burton used to say that, well, I'm just reciting other people's words. What am I really doing?
Mm.
So but it's any art. I think you're in the arts, and it's also so subjective.
Mhm.
You know, and you
Well, yeah.
need to be vulnerable, and you need to
Yes.
be vulnerable and open also, so your characters can be. I just thought of that now. No, really, I
Yeah.
think I'm not going to change. I'm not going to now suddenly become closed, and if people are cruel or say something, sometimes I don't think in the moment to respond.
Sure.
Mhm.
But I think that, you know, that's an interesting point too. You know, that I think the people who are, you know, who like lash out or who are critical, I think that also comes, it's almost like the flip side of the coin of that same fear that we're talking about, right?
Yeah.
But instead of having the kind of maybe the wherewithal, the bravery, or the willingness to discuss it, you know, that's just the version that they use as that protective armor.
That's a very good point,
know?
because a friend of mine who's an attorney, he's very sarcastic.
Right.
Always sarcastic and sardonic, and you don't ever know what he's really saying. But of course, it's totally protective armor.
Yeah.
That's a very good point.
Yeah.
But sometimes in the moment, if someone says something
Sure.
that seems so cruel or mean, you can't always, it's like,
Oh, of course.
you know. But that's true, I'm sure, and they're feeling just as insecure, and they're showing in a different way.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah.
Absolutely, because it's hard to be open and say how you're feeling. Some people find that very hard.
Sure.
I think in the arts, it's a little easier for us. We've been actors.
Mhm.
We're used to living in our emotion.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Right.
So I think, so I think for us especially,
Yeah.
it's easier.
Yeah.
Mm. Well, one of the threads I'm thinking about talking about kind of criticism and other people's negativity always makes me think of book reviews, whether they're reader reviews or critic reviews. And your book is very well reviewed on Goodreads. You have a lot of love, and I was really happy to see that. But
Thank you.
in the case that you've gotten any criticism, whether it be in person or online, how do you cope with it? And are there any tips you would give, you know, debut authors who are just kind of entering into this world of fresh hell that is negative reader responses?
Well, you remember, as actors, we were always told, don't read our reviews.
Mhm.
Not that we didn't.
Mm.
And so I started reading Goodreads reviews with saving grace. And it's all over the place. You'll get a 5-star, you'll get a 1-star. It's unbelievable. And sometimes people like John Simon, who used to work for New York Magazine, he would talk about what people look like. This one's ugly or horrible.
Yeah.
But I see some of these horrible things people would write. And I remember my husband early on said, don't read Goodreads. You're going to get this, you're going to get that. Don't even read it, because there was a whole thing where someone was deliberately giving 1-stars to people, and it was like some kind of scam, and
Yep.
people were very upset with Goodreads. So what I would say is I don't read them the way I used to. And I would say to debut authors that it's very hard not to, especially with your first book, because this is your first book. But I think you have to develop a thick skin, which they always tell us in acting, and who really develops it anyway. And you not taking things personally, and who doesn't take things personally. So I think you have to find a way to have the confidence in yourself it's almost like your armor, even when you're feeling vulnerable, that words are just words, sticks and stones, and you shouldn't let that affect either your next performance as a performer or your book or how you write or what you write. And in some ways it's better not to read them because you're not influenced. And so I would say to a debut author, you may start reading them and then stop at one point, maybe with your second book. But I hardly even look at Goodreads anymore.
That's very
Because where people say I got a starred review and Kirk has got, it starts becoming a competition.
yes.
Oh, my book didn't get a starred review. And they, I remember in a yoga class, they all said the worst thing you can do is compare yourself to the person next to you.
Yep.
And we all do that too.
Sure.
Constantly.
Sure.
Well, are they feeling is insecure? Are they better? Are they this? Are they that? And you could have this voice in your head that goes on forever.
Yeah.
And that's like getting in the way of your characters too. So
Yeah.
I would just say at some point, stop reading reviews.
Okay.
I don't think it helps. I don't think it helps you as an author. Most of these people are not writers. It's nice if you get emails from readers. That's nice. And you can go back and forth. That's why events can be nice, because you read the book and people ask questions. But I remember one person asked me this question. She said, well, if you're writing a murderer, you're writing this person, how can you write that person if you've never killed anyone? So I said, it's called imagination. And then my husband was sitting next to her, and he didn't say anything at the moment, but then he said afterward that he would have said to her, and talent.
Yes. There it is.
But that's what I would say. Just stop reading. Stop reading the reviews at some point. They're not going to be helpful.
And also, I just want to highlight one thing you said that's so brilliant, which is it will get in the way of your characters. So you're bad for your character's health to read reviews. And I would even go a step further to say to look at social media when you're in like the throes of writing a book, because all of this stuff, it's bad for our health, our mental health as writers and humans, but
terrible.
Also for character development when you're in that very fragile state of, conceiving our books, our stories, our characters. You start to get into that compare and despair mind, it will set you back. So for all of the kind of like pragmatists out there, like it's just not practical.
I totally agree. I was doing a lot of social media because you're expected to, and I was getting sucked in and taking up all my time. And now I'm working and I'm thinking I'm writing. This is more important. And I haven't posted. And I thought, so I lose followers. Who cares? But you can make yourself crazy with all this.
Right.
This one's posting that. Oh, my book's this. And social media we didn't have years ago. So it makes it a lot more complicated.
Right.
Another competition.
Right. Yet again.
No, you're absolutely right. Absolutely. Oh my God. So true.
On the topic of next performances, as you mentioned a few moments ago, with our last few minutes with you, would you be able to maybe kind of tease out a little bit of the project that you're maybe working on now or have upcoming?
Well, I actually have a book. I go to Florida half the year. So I have the idea for a series. So I completed a book. It's with my agent set in Florida because I needed someone on death row.
Okay.
And I wanted an idea for a series.
Right.
But while I've been waiting, my editor had said, since you worked in publishing and you were an actress, could you set something in publishing or the theater? Because readers love that. I don't know if she's right, but that's what she said. So I had years ago actually come up with an idea for a book set in the theater. And it's been quite a challenge
Mm.
because I'm trying now to make it a story. And there are things I like about it, and it's the theater, and there's so much you can do with the theater.
Sure.
And one of my favorite plays of all time is Luigi Pirandello's Six Characters in Search of an Author.
Yeah.
Mm.
So there's so much you can do with theater. So this is what I'm working on now, and it's a tremendous challenge because of all you can do with the theater.
Yeah.
And you just have to sort of just let your character go down a road and stay on that road. Because of all the books I've written, that I'd say this is the most challenging for that reason,
Okay.
which I'm sure you can understand because it's the theater,
Yeah.
reality and illusion.
Yeah.
Mm.
So that's what I'm working on now while waiting to hear about and that could be an idea for a series, possibly an actress.
Okay.
A series with an actress.
Okay. So a couple
Ooh.
potential series bubbling. I like
Yeah.
it.
Yes, a couple, which is very
Yeah.
different from standalones. I just
Yeah.
thought it'd be something different, to do a series.
Yeah.
Ooh, I'm intrigued.
Yeah.
I can't wait. Wow.
I know you should be my first readers because you're theater people.
Say
We would
when.
Give
be
me some good
honored.
Yeah.
You give me some good feedback, and that's the other thing I was going to mention. You have each other,
Yeah.
and some authors do have partner people they give their work to, and I don't do that. And I was going to actually ask you that you feel working together makes it helps a lot because you're bouncing things off each other
Mhm.
all the time. So that's really probably really helpful, right?
It is.
Absolutely. No, I think the safety in numbers that we learned in elementary school like really applies in the creative arts. Even if it's not like, an actual collaborator, I think having, one or two or three really close-knit people who you can work with in that capacity is so
Early
helpful.
readers.
And who isn't, this might be controversial, but like maybe who isn't a spouse or a family member, like someone who's totally objective.
Right.
That knows you well enough. Greg and I have almost 30 years of friendship under our belt, but like you don't have to like also see them that they didn't like wash the dishes or empty the dishwasher.
Very true. Very true.
Yeah.
Oh my God. You're like Compton and Green.
Yes, that's right.
They worked together all those years.
That's right. That's right.
That's really something. I'd love to ask you a lot of questions. We'll have to do that next time.
The next dinner, when you finish your next one, we'll have you on and we can do a little reversal.
That would be great. That would be wonderful. I have so many things I want to ask you.
Right. Well,
but
I
this
know.
has been great.
Yeah.
It's been great.
Yeah. No, thank you I can't believe we've like blown through an hour already. That was amazing.
Yeah.
I know we could talk all day.
We could indeed. Well, considering that we do have to let you go now, could you, and I know that you mentioned earlier that you're not, huge on social media, but could you kind of tell our listeners where they can find you out in the world, whether it be social media, website, if you have events coming up, anything you want to put out there?
Absolutely. Yes. I'm at DebbieBabbitt.com.
Okay.
Which is it's hard because my last name, the computer will keep putting two B's, but it's one B, DebbieBabbitt.com. And Debbie Babbitt author I'm on Instagram, I'm on Facebook, Debbie Babbitt author, Threads, what are all the other ones? Facebook, I'm everywhere. You can find me everywhere. TikTok, although I don't post that much on TikTok. It's too much work.
Same.
And I like Instagram Reels much better and Facebook Reels. I find they're much more user friendly.
Okay.
And I'm doing a signing at Barnes and Noble here in my neighborhood on 87th and 3rd. I'm signing copies of all three books. I just had an event there. And I'll be doing more in the Hamptons this summer, signing books at the bookstores.
Oh, great. Okay.
You're going to be out this summer? You're
Yeah,
gonna be coming?
definitely going to be out for 4th of July for a bit, and then a bit here and there. So yeah, I'll keep an eye peeled for you.
Great. Oh, this is wonderful. And will you both be at Thriller Fest?
Yep, I'll be at Thriller Fest this year. So
Greg
yeah,
will. Yes,
Yeah.
I'll be there in spirit.
she'll be here.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I may stop by. I've just been it's a lot of we'll get into that another time.
Sure.
A lot of conferences, whether there's something we should be doing or not. But
Yeah,
anyway,
that's
more
a
time.
whole other show. That's a great idea.
Yeah.
Well, thank you again, Debbie.
Thank
It
you.
was such a pleasure. And I will take us out. Impostor Hour with Liz and Greg is created and hosted by us, Elizabeth Keenan and Greg Wands. The show is produced and edited by Bookwild Collective founder Kate Herget, and Scott Leeds composed our original theme music, and Steve Luoma designed our logo.
And you can find us on IG at Impostor Hour Podcast and online at impostorhour.com. Thanks for listening.